At the edge of a forgotten Wyoming town, beneath a sky that always seemed a little too wide, Margaret Maggie Adams sat behind the wheel of her battered Ford pickup. The windshield bore the ghosts of old bugs, dust, and Wyoming wind, but through it, Maggie stared at the weathered wooden sign. Tompkins Stockyard, horse auction every Thursday. She killed the engine, heart thudding, hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. 52 wasn't young, but Maggie felt ancient this morning. Older than the bare cottonwoods along the fence, older than the sun-bleached boards of the auction ring. She hadn't planned to come. After all, what business did a childless widow, living on a neglected ranch with peeling paint and broken fences, have at a horse auction? She told herself it was habit. She used to come every year with her daughter before the accident, before the house went quiet except for the creak of the wind and the memory of laughter. Now, she lived alone, each day blending into the next. But some part of her, stubborn and aching, had dragged her here today. Inside, the auction barn smelled of hay, manure, and old fear. The wooden bleachers groaned under the weight of weathered men in boots and jeans, their faces a mix of boredom and hard calculation. Horses, skinny and wild-eyed, were paraded through the ring. Some lifted their heads, hopeful, but most just shuffled, resigned to their fate. Maggie settled herself at the back, trying not to draw attention. She tucked her hands under her thighs, determined just to watch. That was when she saw him. Lot 47, Renegade, the handler called, half shouting, half apologizing. A battered, dark bay stallion was shoved into the ring, head tossing, eyes wide. His coat was dull, patches rubbed raw by too tight ropes and hard travel. The whites of his eyes flashed, rimmed with red, and scars crisscrossed his flank like old stories nobody wanted to remember. The crowd shifted, muttering. A couple of teenagers in ball caps laughed and pointed. "That one's crazy! He'll bite your arm off!" Someone jeered. Another, an older rancher with tobacco-stained teeth, barked, "Ought to send him straight to slaughter. He's no use to anyone." Maggie's heart twisted. She couldn't look away. There was something about the stallion, a wildness, yes, but also a desperation that echoed something inside her. A memory flickered. Her daughter Annie, hands on her hips, declaring, "Mama, every horse deserves a second chance, even the wild ones, especially them." Bidding started low. The auctioneer's voice was brisk, but nobody wanted this horse. $50, do I hear 50? 30? 20? Come on, folks, you can't get a better deal? Silence. Laughter. Renegade spun, ears flat, hooves sliding dangerously close to the edge of the ring. Someone in the crowd shouted, "He's not worth the hay he'll eat, Uncle!" Maggie felt her pulse in her ears. Her mouth was dry. She knew this was foolish. She didn't have money to spare, and a horse like that could break a person, not just in body but in spirit. But then she heard Annie's voice again, soft as a prayer, urging her on. Without thinking, she raised her hand. "I'll take him." The whole barn seemed to freeze. Heads whipped around. A few people snickered, thinking she must be joking. The auctioneer blinked. "Sold to the lady in the back for $20. Heat burned Maggie's cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to take it back, but it was done. She could feel every eye in the barn on her, a few shaking their heads, more whispering. "That's Maggie Adams. Hasn't been right since her daughter died. What's she doing with a killer like that?" She signed the papers with a trembling hand. Outside, the handler smirked as he passed her the rope. "You sure you want this one, ma'am? He'll fight you every step." Maggie didn't answer. She just looked at Renegade. Up close, he was even more battered than she'd thought. His sides heaving, nostrils flaring. She whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear, "It's just you and me now." He jerked at the rope, eyes wild, nearly pulling her off her feet. A chorus of laughter rose behind her. She ignored it. Jaw set, she led him toward her trailer. Every step felt like a test. Her boots skidded on the dirt, his hooves scraping, snorting, muscles bunching for flight. A sudden crash. He reared, rope burning Maggie's hands as she tried to hold on. For a second, she nearly let go. The handler started forward. "Told you, he's trouble." But Maggie tightened her grip, talking softly. "Easy, boy. Easy. We've both had enough running." Renegade froze. For a breath, his trembling eased, just a fraction. But it was enough for Maggie to coax him up the ramp, the crowd still jeering, still watching. She closed the trailer door, heart hammering, chest tight with fear and something dangerously close to hope. Maggie climbed into her truck, knuckles raw, eyes stinging. As she drove away, the stockyard faded in her rearview mirror, but the sound of laughter and scorn lingered. The world saw an old woman and a lost cause. But Maggie saw a horse who hadn't been given a real chance, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to get up tomorrow. And as the Wyoming wind howled across the empty fields, Maggie whispered to the empty cab, "We're going home, Renegade. This time nobody's getting left behind." Maggie's old pickup rattled down the gravel road, the evening sun painting everything in a battered gold. In the trailer, Renegade thrashed and snorted, slamming his weight against the metal sides. Maggie gripped the wheel, jaw tight, every jolt sending a spike of doubt through her chest. By the time she pulled up beside her sagging barn, the sky had shifted to purple, and the cold Wyoming wind cut through her jacket. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of what she'd just done. She parked, stepped out, and stood for a moment, looking at her land, the broken fences, the overgrown weeds, the house with one light burning in the kitchen window. It had been years since another living creature had come home with her. She felt the emptiness closing in, but she squared her shoulders and went to the trailer. Opening the back, Maggie braced herself. Renegade's eyes rolled, whites showing. His entire body tense as a wire. He refused to move, so she waited, speaking low and steady. "Come on, boy. No one's here to hurt you." He didn't trust her. Of course he didn't. He charged once, sending a shiver of panic up her spine. She stood her ground, hands shaking, and eventually, slowly, Renegade stepped out into the dying light. Getting him into the barn was a battle of will. He lunged at shadows, spun in place, nearly knocked her down twice. Once inside, Maggie removed the rope with shaking hands and quickly stepped out of the stall. She locked the gate, heart racing. He glared at her from the darkness, breath ragged, ears flattened. In the next stall, nothing but old dust and broken memories. She brought him water, hay, even an apple she'd found rolling in the back of her fridge. Renegade ignored it all, standing rigid in the corner, ready to bolt or fight. Maggie watched from a distance, silent. She wanted to cry, but didn't. Instead, she pulled an old stool over and sat just outside the stall, humming quietly, the sound thin and uncertain in the empty barn. Night crept in. The barn filled with cold, and Renegade's eyes shone back at her from the gloom. She made herself busy, sweeping, mending a loose board, talking to herself more than to the horse. "Annie always said you gotta earn their trust. Guess that goes both ways, huh? Still, the horse wouldn't come near. He refused all food, pacing endlessly, lashing out at the air. Hours passed. Maggie checked her watch and realized it was well past midnight, but she didn't leave. She wrapped herself in an old quilt, listening to the wind howl outside, the barn creaking in reply. Memories came. Unbidden, Annie's laughter in the fields, the two of them riding side by side, Maggie's arms around her small daughter's waist. The day the world changed. A sharp turn, a screech, shattered glass. Maggie had lost more than a daughter that day. She'd lost herself. She opened a book, Annie's favorite, the spine cracked and pages dog-eared. By the weak lantern light she began to read, voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. She read old stories of wild horses and brave women, letting the words fill the silence. Sometimes she sang, low and soft, half-remembered lullabies from Annie's childhood. Renegade never looked at her, but his pacing slowed. His ears flicked toward her voice, just barely. She kept reading, kept singing, her voice the only bridge between her loneliness and his terror. As dawn crept through the cracks in the barn, painting streaks of blue and silver across the floor, Maggie's voice was hoarse. Her eyes burned, her body aching from the cold. She stood, knees popping, and shuffled to the stall. Renegade stood rigid, nostrils flaring. Maggie held out her hand, palm open, a piece of apple resting in her palm. She didn't move. She didn't plead. She just waited. For long minutes, nothing happened. Maggie's arm trembled. She was about to give up, let the apple drop, when Renegade's head lowered, inch by cautious inch. He sniffed, snorted, and in a single sharp motion, snatched the apple from her palm. Maggie gasped, heart thudding. Renegade jerked back, tense as a spring, but he didn't attack. He didn't turn away. She stepped back, swallowing the lump in her throat. For the first time since Annie died, hope flickered inside her, a fragile thing, not quite ready to show itself in daylight. She watched as Renegade chewed, each bite echoing in the hush of the barn. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold through the windows. Maggie sat again, watching the stallion settle, his sides heaving but less wild now. She whispered, "That's it, boy. We're both still here." The exhaustion caught up with her. Maggie leaned against the stall, closing her eyes for a moment, letting herself drift between sleep and waking. The ache in her bones softened by the horse's quiet munching. Outside, the ranch was still lonely, the fences still broken, the grass still choked with weeds. But inside the barn, something had shifted. Small, invisible, but real. The beginning of trust. The start of a fight neither of them could win alone. By the time she stumbled inside for coffee, the sky was full daylight. Maggie's hands were raw, her eyes red. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw not just an old widow, but a woman who'd survived one more night. And a horse who, against all odds, had taken a first trembling step toward home. Morning came slow and pale over Maggie's ranch, the old house groaning as it warmed in the weak Wyoming sunlight. Maggie brewed coffee in her tiny kitchen, her bones heavy from the sleepless night. But a tiny spark burned inside her, a strange hope that felt almost too delicate to touch. She pulled on her battered boots and shrugged into her faded jacket, glancing in the hallway mirror before heading out. For the first time in a long while, she saw not just grief, but a sense of quiet purpose in her reflection. At the barn, Renegade stood where she'd left him, eyes alert but not wild, his powerful body trembling with every new sound. Maggie paused at the door, holding her breath as she approached, moving slow, her hands low and empty. She greeted him with a soft, "Good morning," keeping her voice low and steady, not daring to cross into his space. She set a fresh bucket of water just inside the stall and scattered some sweet hay within reach, then sat down on her stool a few feet away, watching and waiting. It became her new ritual. Each morning, she'd arrive at the barn and let Renegade see her coming. She never forced contact, never reached too fast. Instead, she cleaned his wounds as best she could, sometimes through the rails, sometimes from a careful distance, using soft rags and the gentlest touch. The wounds were ugly. Some still raw, others just angry scars that mapped his long, hard journey. Maggie talked as she worked, telling stories about Annie, about horses they'd known and rescued, about second chances. She swept the barn, shored up the stalls, fixed the broken gate hinge, and always made sure Renegade could watch her moving through the light and dust. He'd follow her with those dark eyes, still wary but slowly, inch by inch, less haunted. When he let her, she brushed his neck, feeling his skin shudder beneath her fingers, but she never pushed, never rushed. Some days he refused all food. Other mornings he'd accept an apple or carrot, snatched quick from her palm, his lips brushing her skin before he'd recoil as if ashamed of the gesture. One afternoon, a red truck pulled up at the end of the drive. The dust rose in swirls behind it, catching the morning sun like a memory of fire. Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped outside, heart in her throat, until she saw the familiar figure behind the wheel, Dr. Emma Cooper. Emma had been Annie's friend first, then Maggie's, a vet with a reputation for fixing what nobody else could. She wore her hair in a messy braid, her face open and kind, with a sharp wit that had once made Annie laugh until she cried. Emma hopped out of her truck, carrying a battered medical bag and a smile. "Morning, Maggie. Heard you picked up a project," Emma said, eyeing the barn. Her tone was gentle but curious, never mocking. Maggie gave a small smile. "He's a mess, Emma, but he's got a good heart, I think." They walked into the barn together. Emma approached the stall with a practiced calm, reading Renegade's posture the way some folks read a book. She didn't push, just let the horse see her, hear her voice. After a while, she set down her bag and showed Maggie how to make a poultice for the worst of the wounds. They worked together in silence, side by side, sharing memories of Annie, her stubbornness, her laughter, the way she used to sing to horses while mucking stalls. Emma brought medicine, antibiotics for infection, ointment for old cuts, and left behind quiet encouragement. "You're doing more than most folks would. If you need help, you call me, all right?" Maggie nodded, feeling a weight lift. It had been years since someone had offered help without judgment, just friendship. When Emma left, Renegade watched the door, then shifted his gaze back to Maggie, something softer flickering in his eyes. Days blurred into a gentle pattern. Maggie rose early, tended Renegade's wounds, sang while sweeping the aisles, mended tack, and read old horse stories aloud as the sun faded in the west. The ranch felt a little less empty now. The silence, once suffocating, was broken by the rhythm of care, the hum of work, the sound of Renegade's hooves pacing in the straw. Sometimes in the golden light before sunset, Maggie caught herself humming one of Annie's tunes, feeling, if only for a heartbeat, like the world wasn't so broken after all. She hung wildflowers on the stall door, a silly habit Annie had started as a child, and watched as Renegade sniffed them, curiosity slowly outweighing fear. She fixed a section of fallen fence out back, sweating under the midday sun, and noticed a pair of deer slipping through the grass, unafraid. Even the crows seemed to call less harshly as they circled overhead. Maggie found herself talking to them, to the horse, to Annie's memory, her voice no longer echoing off empty walls but meeting small, living responses. The days were still hard. There were setbacks. Nights when Renegade wouldn't let her near. Mornings when he stood in the corner, sides quivering, refusing food or touch. On those days, Maggie sat in the straw outside his stall, knees pulled to her chest, and simply waited. She didn't force the connection. She understood, in a way only someone deeply wounded can, that trust must grow slow, roots searching through rock and old pain. Gradually, though, Maggie felt something shift inside herself too. The purpose she found in Renegade's care filled the hollow spaces left by Annie's absence. She noticed details, the way sunlight painted gold on Renegade's mane, the smell of new hay, the hush of the world at dawn. She took pride in small things, a wound healing, a mouthful of hay eaten, a moment when Renegade stood close without flinching. One evening, as Maggie was tacking up a new plank in the old feed room, she heard the steady sound of hooves behind her. She turned and saw Renegade standing at the edge of his stall, watching her not with fear, but with interest, ears pricked forward. Maggie stood very still, heart thudding, afraid to break the fragile peace. "Hey there, big guy," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Looks like you're getting used to me, huh?" For the first time, she felt a flicker of something like companionship, a thread stretching between them, thin but unbroken. That night, Maggie lingered in the barn long after sunset, feeling, despite everything, like she and Renegade were both learning how to be alive again. The house still echoed with memories. The fields still ached with silence. But the ranch no longer felt abandoned. It felt, in some small way, like home. The days slipped by, measured in sunrise light slanting across the barn and the slow, patient ritual of trust, built one careful step at a time. Maggie settled into her new routine. Early mornings with Renegade, tending his wounds, talking and singing softly, filling the barn with something like hope. Each evening, as dusk settled over the faded ranch house, she felt less like a ghost in her own home and more like a woman with a purpose, no matter how uncertain. One crisp afternoon, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the peaceful hush. Maggie glanced up from the garden where she'd stubbornly tried, again, to coax life from the tangled weeds. A battered old Buick rolled up the driveway, its fender dented and trunk held shut with baling twine. Out stepped Edna Harris, Maggie's nearest neighbor, if you could call 3 miles near. Edna was a fixture in the community, known for her sharp tongue, practical mind, and an ever-present plaid jacket. She never visited without a reason. Edna marched right up to Maggie, arms loaded with a faded wool blanket. She stopped short, eyeing Maggie and the barn with suspicion. "Heard you bought yourself a wild stallion, Maggie," Edna called, her voice gruff but not unkind. Maggie brushed the dirt from her jeans and managed a half-smile. "Word travels fast out here, Edna. He's not wild. Just hurt is all." Edna grunted, shifting the blanket to her other arm. "Humph. That's what they said about my Harold, too, God rest his soul." She handed Maggie the blanket. "Found this in the attic. Figured that horse of yours could use it more than the moths. You sure you know what you're doing?" Maggie accepted the gift with a grateful nod. I appreciate it. I really do. Curiosity, and perhaps something gentler, flickered in Edna's eyes. Mind if I meet him? Together they walked to the barn, Edna's boots leaving neat prints in the dust. Inside, the barn was warm, filled with the scent of hay and horses and the soft rhythm of Renegade's breathing. The stallion stood in his usual spot, alert but calmer now, watching the newcomers. Edna peered over the stall door. He's a big one. Looks like he's been through hell. Maggie stroked the blanket, draping it over the stall door. He has. Haven't we all, though? They stood in silence for a moment. The only sound the gentle munch of hay as Renegade nibbled, finally learning to eat without fear. Maggie found herself talking, really talking, for the first time in months. I lost Annie 2 years ago. The ranch just hasn't been the same since. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, eyes never leaving the horse. She loved animals. Always said every broken thing deserved a second chance. Even me when I'd get too hard on myself. Edna's face softened, the lines of worry easing for a heartbeat. I remember Annie. She was good people. She was, Maggie said, swallowing hard. Sometimes I think I take on these lost causes just to feel closer to her. Edna reached out, gave Maggie's arm a gentle squeeze. Well, the world needs more folks willing to take chances, even if the neighbors think they're crazy. The two women shared a quiet laugh. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door, but inside there was a fragile peace. Edna stayed for coffee, perched awkwardly on an upturned feed bucket, regaling Maggie with stories about her late husband, her garden, and the general state of the town. But as the afternoon faded, the mood shifted. Edna's eyes flicked to Maggie, serious now. You know what folks are saying, right? The talk at Miller's store is that you've lost your mind, buying a killer horse. Some think you're trying to get yourself hurt. Maggie stiffened, the old ache of isolation pressing in. Let them talk. People always do. I'm not saying they're right, but you need to know. Rumors move fast out here. Some folks think you're a hero. Some think you're asking for trouble. Maggie stared into her coffee, the steam fogging her glasses. Let them come see for themselves. Renegade's not what they think. Edna nodded, her lips pursed. I believe you, Maggie. If you need anything, help fixing a fence, another blanket, just say the word. Maggie blinked hard, feeling the warmth of old friendship. Thank you, Edna. That means more than you know. After Edna left, Maggie lingered in the barn, running her fingers along the rough wood of the stall, letting Renegade's steady breathing calm her nerves. Outside, the sun dipped low, the sky a riot of orange and purple. She talked to Renegade as she worked, her words drifting into the gathering twilight. People always fear what they don't understand. I guess I've been just as guilty. But you and me were not alone. Not anymore. The peace was delicate, easily broken. Later that night, Maggie lay awake in her narrow bed, the voices of the town swirling in her mind. Was she foolish to believe she could help this horse and herself find healing? Or was hope, as Annie once said, the bravest thing of all? As she drifted towards sleep, the wind outside carrying the faint sound of a neighbor's radio and distant laughter, Maggie held tight to the fragile connections she'd begun to rebuild. The road ahead was uncertain, and doubt pressed at the edges of her faith. But she knew, deep down, that something had changed. For the first time in years, she wasn't fighting her battles alone. The next morning, she found the old blanket folded neatly on Renegade's stall, a quiet reminder that even in a world full of rumors and skepticism, kindness could still find its way in. One friend, one horse, one day at a time. The Wyoming wind blew hard that week, rattling loose shutters and sending tumbleweeds bouncing across the lane. Maggie worked through it all, mending fences, cleaning stalls, brushing Renegade as best he'd allow. Each day brought a new rhythm, a quiet sense of progress. Even Edna stopped by again, sometimes with fresh eggs, sometimes just to talk, always keeping an eye on Maggie and the battered horse that had become the talk of the county. Word was spreading, both good and bad. But on a Thursday morning, as a storm brewed in the distant mountains, trouble came walking straight down Maggie's drive. She was hauling a sack of oats to the barn when she heard the grind of gravel and the chug of an engine. A truck she recognized, mud-spattered, mean, pulled up near the gate. Frank Mason, the local horse trader, known for his sharp deals and sharper tongue, stepped out with a sneer already fixed on his face. Two men from his crew, both broad-shouldered and silent, followed behind. Frank didn't waste time on pleasantries. Well, if it isn't Maggie Adams and her little rescue operation. His eyes flicked over the ranch, landing on the barn. Heard you bought yourself a real prize. That stallion, Renegade, used to be mine. Maggie's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. You sold him at auction, Frank. He's mine now, fair and square. Frank's grin widened. That auction was a mistake. Horse like that? He's dangerous. Always was. I got a buyer lined up, wants him for meat. Thought I'd do you a favor. Take him off your hands before he hurts you or someone else. Maggie stepped forward, planting her boots in the mud between Frank and her barn. I'm not interested in your favors, Frank. He's not going anywhere. The men behind Frank shifted, clearly waiting for his signal. Maggie's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. Renegade, sensing the tension, paced inside his stall, hooves thudding, nostrils wide. Frank spat into the dirt. You think you're saving him? You're just asking for trouble. Folks are already talking about you, Maggie. Word is you're crazy, putting the whole town at risk for some lost cause animal. Maybe it's time people minded their own business, Maggie shot back. You've made enough money off broken things, Frank. Let someone else try to fix them. Frank's eyes narrowed. You'll regret this. You think that old nag can be fixed? You're as broken as he is. He turned and strode back to his truck, his men following. Maggie's legs trembled. But she didn't let it show until the engine finally faded up the road. Only then did she sag against the fence, pulse pounding. When she looked up, she saw Edna standing by the gate, arms crossed, having watched the whole exchange. He's not done, Edna warned quietly. Frank's a mean one. He doesn't like losing. I can handle him, Maggie said, though her voice was small, the doubt crawling up her spine. That night, the sky split open with thunder, lightning clawing across the horizon. Maggie barely slept, mind racing with memories and worries. She checked on Renegade again and again, flashlight beam bouncing along the barn rafters, eyes searching for anything amiss. At dawn, she found her garden trampled, rows of beans smashed, the gate swinging loose on its hinges. Spray-painted across the barn door were words she hadn't seen in years. Crazy widow, dangerous horse. Maggie stared at the letters, heart thudding in her chest. Anger rising. Frank, or one of his men. She had no proof, but she knew. She called the sheriff and Emma too. Both came quickly. Emma with her vet's bag, the sheriff with a notebook and tired eyes. Frank Mason's been causing trouble all over the county. the sheriff said, taking photos of the damage. "But catching him's another story, unless you got a witness." Emma knelt beside Maggie, voice gentle. "You okay?" Maggie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Emma put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's check Renegade." In the barn, they found the stallion rattled but unharmed. He sidled away from strangers but pressed his nose against Maggie's palm, searching for comfort. Maggie stroked his neck, whispering soft reassurances. Emma checked his wounds, rebandaged where needed, and left extra supplies behind. "I can stay if you want," she offered. Maggie shook her head. "No, thank you, Emma, but I have to do this." The next few days were tense. Frank's threats became rumors, spread by his friends in town, whispered at the feed store and the diner. People drove by slow, staring, some shaking their heads, others just curious. Maggie felt the weight of every glance. She patched the barn door, pulled weeds in the ruined garden, kept her chin up for Edna and for herself, even when it felt impossible. At night, she lay awake, listening for engines in the dark, clutching her old shotgun, the loneliness pressing in like never before. She thought of Annie. What would she say? "Don't quit, Mama. The world needs someone who believes in lost causes." The words stuck with her, carrying her through the next assault. This time, a fence slashed, hay scattered, tire tracks carved through her field. She filed another report, the sheriff's tone more apologetic each time. "He's pushing you, Maggie, trying to break you." But Maggie refused to quit. Each morning, she checked on Renegade before anything else, her presence calming him, her determination growing with every small act of care. Edna stopped by more often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to sit and watch the sun rise over the battered ranch. Even Emma called each night to check in, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. Still, Maggie felt alone, the town's skepticism like a storm cloud always overhead. Yet every time Renegade let her touch him, every time he took an apple from her hand, she felt a flicker of hope. She remembered Annie's stubbornness, the way she'd never let go of a horse or a dream without a fight. So Maggie fought back. She posted cameras, changed locks, and refused to be run off her own land. When Frank or his men drove by, she met their eyes, unflinching. And in those small acts, defiance, kindness, belief, Maggie found something she thought she'd lost forever. The courage to stand for what mattered, even when the whole world thought she was wrong. The ranch was battered, her reputation in shreds. But in the quiet morning light, with Renegade nuzzling her palm and the wind singing through the grass, Maggie knew she was exactly where she belonged. The summer storm rolled over Maggie's ranch just past midnight, thick black clouds boiling over the mountains and spilling across the empty fields. The wind rattled the windows, tearing loose shingles and sending branches clattering down the lane. Lightning strobed across the sky, and thunder rolled so close it shook the kitchen table. Maggie sat awake in her old armchair, clutching a mug of coffee she'd long since forgotten to drink. Her nerves prickled with every gust. Since Frank's last visit, each strange sound in the dark sent her heart pounding. But tonight, the feeling was worse, an electric dread she couldn't shake. Outside, rain slashed against the roof and pattered on the barn tin. Maggie watched the flicker of headlights crawl up her drive. At first she thought it was only a trick of the storm. But the lights didn't disappear. Instead, they cut out. The ranch was plunged back into darkness. She set her mug down, slow and careful, then crossed to the old gun cabinet. Her hands shook as she loaded the shotgun. "Easy, Maggie," she whispered, just to hear a voice in the quiet. "You've been through worse." But as the wind rattled the walls, the lie felt thin. She peered through the rain-streaked window and caught movement near the barn. A cluster of shadows, 3 or maybe 4. Flashlights flickering as they crept toward Renegade's stall. Maggie's fear snapped into cold determination. She yanked on her boots, threw a jacket over her nightgown, and stepped into the storm, shotgun heavy in her hands. The wind nearly knocked her sideways, but Maggie pressed on, boots sinking in the mud. She could hear voices, low, angry, men trying to keep quiet but failing. "Get the rope, quick, before she sees!" Maggie's jaw clenched. She cocked the shotgun, the sound sharp and unmistakable. "Who's there? Get off my property!" Flashlights spun in her direction. Frank's voice rang out, tense and mocking. "Put the gun down, Maggie. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That horse is mine." Maggie leveled the shotgun, hands steadier than she expected. "You've got no right here, Frank. The sheriff knows what you're up to. I already called him." Thunder cracked. Frank's men hesitated, but Frank pressed on, waving a crowbar. "You think you're the only one who cares about animals? That stallion's dangerous. He's a menace. Town would be better off if he disappeared." Maggie stepped between them and the barn door, heart hammering, rain soaking her hair and plastering her jacket to her skin. "You want him. You'll have to go through me." One of Frank's men, nervous, whispered, "She's crazy, Frank. Let's go." But Frank lunged forward, crowbar raised. Maggie's finger tightened on the trigger. She'd never wanted to fire, but she wouldn't back down. The barn light flickered on behind her. A new voice cut through the chaos. "Sheriff's on the way!" Edna's shout echoed across the yard. Maggie glanced back and saw her friend striding up with a flashlight and a handful of townsfolk. Emma among them, others from the community who'd come running when Edna called for help. Frank and his men faltered, uncertain now, their bravado crumbling in the face of witnesses. The group spread out, 3, 4, 5 neighbors holding lanterns and shouting warnings. "Go on, Frank! Get off her land! This isn't how we do things!" Frank's jaw worked, but the fight was gone from his eyes. He spat at the mud, then jerked his head at his men. "Let's go! This isn't over, Maggie!" They scrambled for their truck, engines revving, tires spinning in the mud. The sheriff's headlights swept the drive just as they disappeared into the night. Maggie stood, soaked to the bone, hands trembling. Shotgun still raised. Edna was at her side in an instant, sturdy and fierce. "You all right?" Maggie nodded, barely breathing. "He tried to take Renegade." Emma hugged her, voice low. "He won't try again, not with half the county watching." The neighbors gathered close, checking the barn. Renegade, wild-eyed and sweating, had battered himself bloody against the stall, but was otherwise unharmed. Maggie opened the gate and stepped inside, talking softly until he quieted. Nose pressed to her shoulder, breath hot and scared. The sheriff arrived, boots splashing through puddles. He took statements, wrote down every detail. "You did good, Maggie. We'll get Frank for this." Maggie thanked the neighbors, exhaustion crashing over her in a wave. As the adrenaline faded, her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the gun. Edna steadied her, leading her back to the porch, Emma close behind. Inside, as the storm eased and dawn crept over the ranch, Maggie realized she was no longer alone. The people she thought had turned away were here, helping, defending her in the dark. She saw, for the first time in years, how courage could pull people together, how kindness could ripple out in ways she'd never expected. Edna squeezed her hand before leaving, her gruff voice gentler than usual. "You stood your ground tonight. We're proud of you." Emma packed up, promising to check in tomorrow. The other neighbors drifted home, leaving Maggie with a mug of hot coffee and a shaky sense of victory. When the sun finally rose, gold pouring across the battered fields, Maggie stood at Renegade's stall, hands resting on the warm wood, heart full and sore. The fear was still there, but now it shared space with something stronger: gratitude and the beginning of real belonging. The night had changed things. The town's whispers would be different now. Renegade pressed his nose to her palm, breathing deep. Maggie smiled, exhaustion melting into hope. "We made it through, boy. Maybe we're not so alone after all." And as the new day dawned over her small, battered ranch, Maggie finally let herself believe that healing, real, lasting healing, might be possible for them both. The storm had left deep puddles in the rutted driveway and scattered branches across the yard, but inside Maggie's barn, a softer quiet had settled after the long, tense night. Renegade's body trembled with exhaustion, his sides flecked with sweat and old blood where he'd battered himself in panic. Maggie spent the early morning at his side, cleaning new scrapes and speaking in a gentle, steady voice, the way Annie had always done with frightened animals. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Frank Mason had faded, replaced by an aching tenderness, one that left Maggie's hands surprisingly steady, even as her heart still raced. Emma arrived with the first light, toolbox in hand, her face drawn and serious. She checked Renegade's wounds, pressing cold compresses to the worst of the bruises and carefully dabbing ointment on torn skin. "He's lucky you were here," Emma murmured, examining the horse's dark eyes. "And you're lucky too, Maggie. That was a close one." Maggie nodded, words slow in coming. "He's all I've got, Emma. I couldn't let them take him. I just couldn't." Emma didn't answer for a while, only kept working. Maggie helped as best she could, fetching clean water, holding bottles and bandages, moving slow so as not to spook the exhausted stallion. The women worked in companionable silence, their movements growing familiar, one tending to old wounds, the other fighting the new. Mid-morning brought Edna stomping in, arms full of supplies, extra feed, blankets, and a thermos of her famously strong coffee. She eyed Renegade's battered form with a worried frown, but said nothing, simply setting her things down and joining the work. Together, the three women formed a small circle of care, working through the pain and the silence, the barn thick with the scent of liniment, hay, and unspoken fears. For a long while, Maggie barely allowed herself to stop, clinging to each small task, as if it was the only thing tethering her to solid ground. But exhaustion, grief, and relief finally caught up with her all at once. When she finished brushing Renegade's mane, she let her hand rest against his neck and, as if a dam had burst, began to sob. Her shoulders shook, tears spilling for Annie, for the years lost to grief, for the pain she'd seen in Renegade's eyes, for the weight she'd carried alone for so long. Emma stepped forward and embraced her, whispering, "Let it out, Mags. You're not alone. Not anymore." Edna cleared her throat, pretending to busy herself with the feed, but her eyes glistened too. "Strongest folks are the ones who know when to cry, Maggie. Don't let anyone tell you different." For the first time in ages, Maggie let herself grieve openly, her cries mingling with the soft snorts and shuffles of the horse beside her. She remembered Annie's laughter echoing across the pasture, the way she used to sing as the sun went down, her bright dreams for the ranch and the horses they loved. I miss her so much. I miss her every day. Emma's grip tightened. She's here, Maggie. In you, in this place, in every good thing you do. When the tears finally slowed, Maggie wiped her face and looked up to find Renegade staring at her, his deep eyes impossibly gentle. With trembling hands, she reached out, and for the first time, Renegade didn't flinch. He pressed his forehead into her palm, his breathing slow and steady. The three women stood in the golden light filtering through the cracks in the old barn, all of them silent, all of them changed. The day passed in a kind of haze. Renegade rested, his breathing growing easier. Emma and Edna kept busy fixing fences, mending tack, making repairs to the barn that had suffered in the storm and the struggle. Maggie floated between helping and watching, her emotions raw but strangely light. With every gentle word and patient touch, it felt as if the pain, hers and Renegade's, was softening, becoming something new. That night, as dusk crept across the ranch and painted the sky in streaks of lavender and gold, Maggie returned to the barn alone. She sat outside Renegade's stall, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the horses' slow breathing and the distant chorus of frogs along the creek. She spoke softly, as she used to with Annie, telling Renegade about the early days on the ranch, the dreams they'd had, the horses they'd saved, the laughter that once filled every corner of this place. She told him about her daughter's stubborn hope, her belief that even the most broken creatures could heal if someone only cared enough to try. Renegade stepped close, head hanging low, his eyes gentle in the half-light. Maggie reached up and stroked his neck, the two of them breathing in the quiet together. "I think you're saving me as much as I'm saving you," she whispered. "Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Two broken things, healing together." The barn was quiet, but Maggie felt a presence there. Not just Renegade and herself, but Annie too, woven into the very timbers and dust. The love and sorrow and hope that filled every space. She realized, with a rush, that she wasn't alone after all. The pain would never vanish, but it could be transformed by compassion, by courage, by the simple act of caring for another soul in need. By morning, Renegade's appetite had returned. He nudged her hand for apples and hay, his body relaxing at her touch. The wounds, both his and hers, would take time to heal. But something essential had shifted in that long, sleepless night. Maggie had faced the depths of her grief, and in doing so, found a new wellspring of strength. Emma and Edna returned at dawn, bringing breakfast and laughter, sharing plans for repairs and routines. Maggie smiled, grateful beyond words for the circle of women who'd stood with her through the storm. As sunlight spilled across the barn and Renegade nickered softly, Maggie knew that healing was messy and hard, never perfect or easy. But it was possible. And that, she thought, was enough for today and for all the gentle mornings yet to come. The news of the stormy night and Maggie's standoff with Frank Mason traveled through town faster than wildfire. For years, the Adams Ranch had stood quiet and forgotten at the edge of the county, just a crumbling reminder of a family's heartbreak. But now, after Maggie's courageous stand, something had shifted in the town's spirit. Folks who once whispered behind their hands about the crazy widow and her wild horse began to see her in a new light. Maggie, without realizing it, had become a symbol, a beacon for anyone who'd ever felt alone, anyone who'd ever wanted to fight for something lost. The changes began slowly. The first was the arrival of Hank Miller, the hardware store owner, with a truckload of lumber rattling in the bed. Maggie met him at the gate, skeptical. Hank was a man of few words and fewer smiles, but he just grunted and said, "Heard you got fences to fix." He parked and started unloading boards, not waiting for thanks. By noon, 2 more neighbors had shown up. Lila Patterson, who brought a bag of feed and her teenage son, and old Mr. Ferguson, who hammered nails as if he'd been doing it for Maggie his whole life. Together, they worked under the big Wyoming sky, laughter and easy conversation rising over the sound of hammers and saws. Emma and Edna returned too, not just as friends, but as leaders. Emma organizing a rotation for the town's kids to help around the ranch. Edna keeping everyone fed and watered with lemonade and her famous molasses cookies. For Maggie, the shock of community was overwhelming at first. She'd been alone so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to accept help, to hear her name called in kindness rather than pity or scorn. The walls she'd built around her grief cracked wider with every act of generosity. With so many hands, the work went faster than Maggie ever thought possible. The barn roof was patched, gates rehung, and the garden, once trampled by spite, was replanted with the promise of fresh tomatoes, beans, and wildflowers. Someone brought paint, and, one sunny Saturday, 6 folks, some Maggie barely knew, showed up to give the house and barn a fresh coat of white. The transformation was more than cosmetic. With every stroke of the brush, every repaired fence post, the old ranch seemed to breathe again, alive with possibility and laughter. But it was Renegade's transformation that caught the town's heart. The stallion, once wild-eyed and dangerous, now grazed peacefully in the paddock, letting children feed him carrots and brush his sleek coat. At first, the kids kept their distance, whispering stories about the killer horse. But Maggie, patient and gentle, taught them how to approach, slow and calm, always speaking softly, always letting Renegade see their hands. One afternoon, a little girl named Jenny slipped under the fence and stood frozen, too scared to move. Renegade, curious, walked over and lowered his big head to sniff her hair. Jenny squeaked in fear, but Maggie called out, "Just stay still, honey, he's just saying hello." The horse nosed Jenny's palm, and she giggled, her fear melting away. From that day on, she became Renegade's biggest fan, telling anyone who'd listen how he wasn't mean at all, just misunderstood. That moment opened the floodgates. Soon, Maggie was surrounded by children, some timid, some bold, all eager to learn. With Emma's encouragement, Maggie started a small riding class for local kids. She dusted off the old tack and patched up saddles, her hands remembering skills she'd once taught Annie. Each lesson became a celebration, each laugh echoing through the fields, filling the ranch with new life. The parents came too, curious at first, then grateful for the chance to let their kids ride and learn responsibility. Even those who'd once doubted Maggie now nodded their approval at the grocery store, some even stopping to ask about Renegade or offer leftover hay. The town that had once shunned her now rallied around her and the ranch. The Adams place, once a symbol of sadness, was reborn as a gathering place, a spot where everyone, child or elder, newcomer or old-timer, was welcome. Edna, ever the practical one, made sure Maggie didn't get overwhelmed. "You don't have to do this alone," she reminded her, roping in volunteers and setting up a chores chart pinned to the barn door. Maggie, at first hesitant, learned to delegate, letting others mend a fence, cook a meal, lead a child's pony ride. It wasn't easy for her to let go of control, But with every shared task, she felt the heavy burden of loneliness lift, replaced by something lighter and sweeter: belonging. The greatest surprise was the effect it all had on Renegade. The stallion, once a shadow of rage and pain, grew calmer and more affectionate by the day. He let the children braid his mane, nuzzled their pockets for treats, and carried even the most nervous riders with a steady, gentle stride. More than once, Maggie caught him standing at the fence at sunset, ears pricked as if listening for Annie's laughter on the breeze. She would stand with him, hand resting on his warm neck, and feel a peace she hadn't known in years. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, the community gathered for a potluck in Maggie's yard. Tables groaned with homemade food, lanterns flickered in the twilight, and laughter rang out across the fields. Maggie, standing with Emma and Edna by her side, watched the children play tag around Renegade's paddock, their shouts rising to the stars. She felt Annie's presence then, real and bright and woven into every part of this new life. When night fell and the last guest left, Maggie lingered at the fence. Renegade stood beside her, his coat gleaming in the moonlight. She whispered, "Look at us now, boy. Who would have thought?" The horse snorted softly, nuzzling her shoulder, and for the first time in a long, hard while, Maggie let herself believe that the future could be good. The ranch, once a place of sorrow, now pulsed with hope. And as Renegade walked among children and elders, calm and whole, Maggie knew that healing, real, lasting healing, had taken root. Not just for her or her horse, but for an entire community. And it all began with a single act of courage and the stubborn decision not to give up on something broken. The weeks after the storm passed in a blur of sunlight, laughter, and work. Maggie's ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Days started early, with children running down the lane, their parents trailing behind with coffee mugs and stories to share. The barn bustled with the sounds of brushing, feeding, and gentle lessons in patience, both for the horses and the kids. Sometimes, Maggie found herself standing quietly in a patch of sunlight, just listening. Joy and grief mingled in her heart, and she let both belong. One golden afternoon, as summer gave way to the first hints of fall, Maggie sat on the porch with Emma and Edna. A gentle breeze lifted the scent of hay and wildflowers, and Renegade grazed nearby, a living symbol of everything that had changed. Edna, sipping her tea, broke the companionable silence. "You know, Maggie, there were days I thought you'd never come back from what happened. I guess none of us did. We all thought, maybe some wounds just can't be healed." Emma nodded, her eyes kind. "But look at you now. You changed this place. You changed all of us. Not just the ranch, the whole town." Maggie looked down at her hands, rough and scarred from work. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "If it was just me, I would have given up a dozen times. Or maybe I wouldn't even have tried. But Annie, she always believed there's no such thing as a lost cause. I guess in some way, I needed to believe it too." She paused, watching a group of kids leading a gentle pony back to the barn. "I learned something these last months. Healing isn't a straight path. Some days you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes you feel like you're back at the start. But if you just keep going, if you let other people help, and if you let yourself care again, things get better. Slowly. Sometimes so slowly you can't see it. But then one morning, you look up and realize you're living again, not just surviving." Emma smiled. "You taught the whole town that, Maggie. You gave them something to root for, something to hope for. Edna, never one for too much sentiment, just grunted. Well, you also made us work our butts off. My back may never recover from that fence. Maggie laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. Sorry, Edna, but you know, I think the fences needed you as much as I did. The three women fell quiet again, and Maggie let herself think deeply about what had changed inside her. The real lesson, not just for herself, but for anyone willing to listen. You know, I used to think bravery was standing up to the world, Maggie said softly. But the hardest thing is hoping again after you've lost everything. Letting yourself feel. Trusting that people won't let you fall. That's the real courage. Letting love back in, even though you know it could break you. Emma's eyes shone. You say that like it's easy. It's not, Maggie replied. It's messy and it hurts. You don't always get it right. Some days you'll want to run, but every time I showed up for Renegade, even when he was scared and mean and wanted nothing to do with me, I was showing up for myself too. I think that's what Annie would have wanted. Edna nodded. Annie was a good judge of people and horses. She'd be proud of you. Maggie wiped her eyes and stood, stretching. You know, maybe there's no such thing as a lost cause. Not really. There's just things we give up on too soon. People, animals, even ourselves. But if you give it time, and you let others help you carry the load, you find there's always another chance waiting. That evening, the town hosted a gathering at the old Grange Hall. They'd asked Maggie to speak, something she hadn't done since Annie's memorial. The room was full. Ranchers, shopkeepers, children, elders, even folks who'd once doubted or whispered behind her back. Standing in front of her neighbors, Maggie felt nerves flutter in her stomach, but she saw Renegade through the window, calm and strong, and found her voice. I never set out to be an example, she began, her words quiet but steady. I just wanted to save one horse. In doing that, I found a way to save myself. I learned that hope isn't some bright, shiny thing. It's stubborn. It keeps coming back, even when you try to shut it out. She looked around at the faces, some tearful, some smiling. We all carry pain. We all know loss. But what matters is what we do next. Will we close ourselves off? Or will we dare to reach out, to love something or someone again? Healing is messy. It's slow, but it's possible. You just have to give it a chance. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the shuffling of boots and a sniffle or two. Take in the lost causes, Maggie finished. Help the broken ones, animals, people, even old ranches. Let's be the kind of place that doesn't give up. If we do that, there's nothing we can't heal together. The applause was long and heartfelt. Afterward, people came up one by one, offering thanks and stories of their own struggles, their own hope. Maggie felt a kinship with them, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since Annie's laughter echoed through her house. That night, back on the porch with Emma and Edna, Maggie gazed out at the starlit fields. Renegade stood nearby, a sentinel in the dark, the living proof of what hope and a little stubbornness could do. We did it, Annie, she whispered to the night. We found a way back. And in that quiet, Maggie realized that her story and Renegade's wasn't just about second chances. It was a lesson in never giving up, in letting love in even when it scares you, in finding community when you least expect it. It was a lesson she hoped everyone in that little Wyoming town would carry for years to come. Months passed, and Wyoming's fierce winter finally loosened its grip, yielding to a green and hopeful spring. Maggie's ranch looked nothing like it had when Renegade first arrived. a place of dust, neglect, and broken dreams. Now the fences stood tall and strong, the barn gleamed with fresh paint, and laughter drifted across fields where wildflowers pushed up through new grass. The Adams Ranch had become a living symbol of resilience and rebirth, a sanctuary for horses and people who needed a second chance. Renegade, the stallion everyone had once written off, led the herd now, a mixture of rescued mares, geldings, and one scrappy Mustang filly. His coat shone, his eyes were bright, and he moved with the easy confidence of an animal that finally understood he was safe. Children ran along the fences, waving and calling his name. Renegade always answered, tossing his head and coming to the rail for an apple or a pat. It was hard to believe this was the same horse who'd once cowered in the shadows, braced for cruelty. But the changes weren't just in Renegade. Maggie, too, was transformed. Her hair had more gray in it now, but her stride was surer. The lines on her face spoke of pain, but also of hard-won wisdom and new joy. She woke each morning before sunrise, not with dread, but with purpose. The ranch had grown into something larger than her grief, larger than any single person. A place where the community could gather, where children learned patience and courage, and where broken spirits found mending. On the first warm Saturday in May, Maggie hosted the ranch's first open day. Word had spread throughout the county. There would be food, games, and a parade of the ranch's horses, led by Renegade himself. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors arrived in pickup trucks and on foot, carrying casseroles, pies, and baskets of wildflowers. Kids in boots and denim dashed through the barn, giggling and shrieking with excitement. The ranch, once silent, thrummed with life and hope. Edna, with her ever-present plaid jacket, directed traffic in the driveway and herded kids away from the tool shed. Emma organized a Meet the Horses tour, answering questions about rescue and care. Hank Miller and his sons grilled burgers, and Lila Patterson helped younger children braid wildflowers into Renegade's mane. The crowd grew until Maggie wondered if the whole county had turned out. The highlight was the children's parade. Maggie watched as the kids lined up, some on horseback, some leading ponies, a few just carrying ribbons. Renegade, gleaming and regal, took his place at the head of the line, a garland of flowers around his neck. When Maggie opened the gate, he stepped forward, calm and gentle, letting even the youngest guide him through the crowd. As he passed, older folks tipped their hats, and newcomers blinked in surprise. Someone whispered, "That's Renegade? The same stallion who was headed for slaughter?" And parents smiled, knowing their children had ridden, brushed, and loved this horse back to life. Maggie led the last pony herself, her hand steady on the lead rope. The applause as she crossed the yard brought tears to her eyes. And she saw Annie everywhere, in every laughing child, every proud parent, every hopeful smile. The ranch had become what Annie once dreamed, a place where every living thing, no matter how broken, could find healing and home. After the parade, the adults gathered in the shade of the barn for lemonade and pie. Maggie found herself at the center of a circle, people sharing stories of hardship and hope, neighbors thanking her for teaching their children, for reminding the town what kindness could do. The sheriff stood with Emma and Edna, the tension of old troubles replaced by real respect. Maggie was asked to say a few words. She hesitated, nerves prickling, but the sight of Renegade grazing nearby steadied her. "I want to thank all of you," she began, voice carrying across the crowd. "Not just for showing up today, but for showing up for each other. When I first brought Renegade home, I was lost. more than I ever let on. I thought if I could help him heal, maybe I'd heal too. But what I learned is we don't heal alone. We need each other. We need community and patience and the stubborn hope to believe in what others have given up on. She paused, looking around at the faces, some familiar, some new, all shining with shared understanding. Renegade was just one lost soul among many, but he reminded me that no creature is ever beyond saving, that redemption and hope can blossom anywhere, if someone cares enough not to quit. This ranch is living proof of that, and so are you. There was a long, quiet moment as her words settled over them. Maggie saw Emma's gentle smile, Edna's proud nod, and the way children leaned into their parents, listening. If you take one thing from today, Maggie said, let it be this. True healing takes time. It takes second chances. It takes showing up again and again for the ones who need us. Don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid to believe. The applause was warm and real. Later, as the party wound down, Maggie wandered the ranch, greeting friends and strangers alike. She watched as kids raced each other to the creek, as parents shared quiet conversations in the barn's shade, as Renegade let Jenny, the little girl who once feared him most, ride him gently around the paddock. That night, when the last guests had gone and the fields were painted silver in the moonlight, Maggie walked out to the barn one last time. Renegade stood at the fence, ears flicking forward, eyes gentle and wise. Maggie rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of hay and horse and spring. We did it, didn't we? She whispered. You and me, and everyone else. We turned pain into something good. She looked around at her ranch, at the mended fences, the shining barn, the garden bursting with green, at the memories of Annie woven now into laughter and living hope. Maggie understood, finally, that healing had no finish line. It was a way of being, a legacy written not just in what she'd survived, but in what she'd built, in every life she'd touched. Months from now, and years after that, children would remember the day Renegade led the parade, and neighbors would recall how Maggie Adams opened her home and her heart to a broken stallion and a broken town. In that memory, they'd find courage for their own losses, faith in new beginnings, and the simple, stubborn wisdom that hope always finds a way. The Adams Ranch stood as a testament to second chances. Not perfect, not painless, but real. A place where healing, like wildflowers after rain, bloomed in the least expected places, whenever someone cared enough to believe. And as Maggie watched the moon climb higher, she felt not just Annie's spirit, but the promise of all the lives yet to be changed by the legacy of the Renegade. She smiled, letting hope settle deep in her bones. This was home. This was family. This was the miracle that comes from never giving up.